Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 7th video of the Old Testament Survey course. In the last section, we gave an introductory overview of the geography of the Old Testament, and in this section we're going to do a similar overview of the history of the Old Testament. Now, this is intended to give you a framework of the big picture historical events as a skeleton in which to fit all of the rest of the events that you will be learning. This then is an outline of the things that God did in the Old Testament. Now, keep in mind that these events are leading up to Jesus, and therefore the Old Testament is an unfinished story that only finds its full conclusion in the New Testament. Now, speaking of the Old and New Testaments, you're likely aware that this is the normal division of the Bible and its history into the two testaments, sometimes called the two covenants. The Old Testament is the story of God's people Israel. It tells the story of creation, the fall into sin, and God's creating the nation of Israel from the family of Abraham and leading them into the promised land as their inheritance. It tells the history of that nation in its waves of faithfulness alternating with waves of idolatry. And it was all preparing for Jesus. And then the New Testament is the story of Jesus and God's people, the church. It tells of the arrival of Jesus, his proclaiming of the kingdom and salvation. It tells of his dying to purchase salvation and to inaugurate the kingdom, and his rising from the dead to rule his kingdom, prove the salvation, and send his Spirit. So this division of Bible history, indeed all of history into the Old and New Testament, is certainly correct and the natural way to divide it. However, that's not the only way to divide biblical history. And there are others which are equally true and logical. They just highlight different issues. So another way to divide history is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis and then the rest of the history of the Bible. You see, Genesis chapters 1 through 11 tell the problem, the rebellion of humanity into sin and its downward spiral into greater sin and its consequences. And then starting with Genesis chapter 12 and going all throughout the rest of the Bible to the end of the book of Revelation tells the solution to this problem. God's plan is revealed and worked out over a long period as his creation is slowly renewed. In other words, God's solution to humanity's problem did not start with Jesus, but started almost from the beginning of the Old Testament and then came to completion in Jesus. And then another way to divide the Bible history is from one paradise to another. Paradise lost and regained. Now, in this division, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are the first paradise, created perfect by God. And then Genesis chapter 3 through Revelation chapter 20 describes the present creation ruined by sin, yet in process of being redeemed. Now, there are different stages and levels of realization of this redemption throughout this large period of time, but none of it is yet a full realization of the promised paradise. We are still awaiting the new paradise promised and described in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. And the coming paradise will be even better than the first paradise. So, something to look forward to. Now, the last way to look at the historical divisions of the Bible is the growth of the kingdom of God. And I want to give credit for this teaching, to see this division and teach this division, to Graham Goldsworthy. First, Genesis chapter 1 through 1 Kings chapter 10. They describe the prospering of the earthly kingdom to the high point under Kings David and Solomon. Then from 1 Kings chapter 11 through the end of the Old Testament, the earthly kingdom declines and fails because of the unfaithfulness of God's people. so that eventually they end up in exile. And yet, at the same time that the earthly kingdom was declining and the prophets were announcing its judgment, the prophets were also announcing the promise of a new, greater kingdom. And then the New Testament is the record of the revelation and the realization of the kingdom of God in Jesus. These then are some of the big divisions of the history of the Bible and some different ways to look at it. And like I said, all of these are helpful and accurate in their own ways. Now let's move on and look at the main way I would like us to divide up the Old Testament history. That is the history of just the Old Testament. And I want to divide it into 5 distinct periods of time covered in the Old Testament. These are the 5 major epochs of Old Testament history. Now, the first epoch is called the prehistory. Now, that does not mean that it happened before history or that it's not real history. It's labeled prehistory because these events happened before what we can know from other sources outside of the Bible. They are real history, as we've argued, but the only way we know about it is because God revealed it in the Scripture. Now, the prehistory epoch contains the following events: the creation of the world, the fall of our first parents into sin, and then the downward spiral of the first humans and their experience of God's wrath against sin. Then the second epoch is the time of the patriarchs. Patriarchs means fathers. And in this epoch, God chooses one man, Abraham, and begins his program of salvation for all humanity through this one man. And he begins by promising to bless the world through Abraham and his offspring. And the promise is protected even in times when it seems extremely doubtful whether the promise would be fulfilled through much ups and downs in history. Then the third epoch is the Exodus and the conquest of the Promised Land. In this epoch, God rescues his people from slavery in Egypt. He then builds them into a nation. He enters a covenant relationship with them and gives them a revelation of his rule. And he leads them to capture and occupy the Promised Land. That brings us to the fourth epoch, which is the time of the monarchy. In this epoch, the nation of Israel is given a king to lead them like the other nations had. Then they have a long series of kings, some of whom lead the nation towards God's blessing and peace, and some of whom lead them away. And during this time, God's people are divided into 2 separate nations because of their sin and idolatry. And near the end of this period, the northern kingdom is taken over by the Assyrian Empire, and it ceases to exist. And then the last epoch is the time of the exile in Babylon and return. During this epoch, the southern kingdom falls into idolatry and is taken captive into Babylon, back in Mesopotamia. And after being disciplined there for 70 years, a small remnant of the people returns to the Promised Land. And this renewal group struggles to be the kingdom of God with varied success. And thus, the Old Testament ends with renewed hope, but without fully experiencing God's promises of blessing. The Old Testament, as I mentioned, it ends with unfinished business, with a cliffhanger that will only be resolved in the New Testament. Now, hopefully these 5 historical categories will help you to have a framework to learn and understand all of the events that you're going to see in the Old Testament. So now let's review the 5 epochs of Old Testament history. They are prehistory, patriarchs, Exodus, conquest, monarchy, and exile, return. To help you memorize these, notice that the first 2 start with P and then the third and the fifth start with E and then are hyphenated with another word. Okay? This has been just a summary introduction for the historical events of the Old Testament. In the next section, we'll look at a similar overview of the division of the Old Testament books themselves. Until then, thanks for watching.